Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is Professor Hall, and this is our second part of looking at the golden age of children's literature. Last time, I introduced the term the golden age, and we talked about some of the developments that led to these beautiful, whimsical stories like The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan and Tom Sawyer and Anne of Green Gables, The Secret Garden, all of those kind of things. We looked at horn books and primers and all the boring, moralizing, didactic stories that came before the ones that we're actually going to read for this class. So today we're going to talk about what it means to be a child and the changing concepts of childhood that took place during this time period. All right, so first, I want us to kind of think about what is a child. We have this idea of the age of majority, meaning the age where you come into being an adult. We have different types of names for this. We have the age of license, when someone has the legal permission to do something from the government. Driving at 16, buying cigarettes at 18, now it's 21 in most places, buying alcohol at 21. We have the age of majority, legal recognition of adulthood, when a person has legal authority over themselves and their decisions. And in different countries, this happens at different times. In Iran, it's 15. In Cambodia, 16. In Canada, 19. In the US and the UK, it's 18. In Egypt, it's 21. In Japan, it's 20. So that's sort of interesting to me because we also today, a couple things are happening, right? People are living longer. If you before had people living until the age of 65, then perhaps the age where you consider people to be children is going to be lower, right? And maybe you can have children doing more things when they're 14, 15, 16. They're taking on jobs or things of that nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. Today, we have a much longer lifespan, right? With many people living till, I think the average age right now is maybe 78, 76, somewhere around there. And we have a little bit better understanding of psychology. Research shows brain development continues into the mid-20s, even the early 30s for some people. So you have people like the actresses I have here on the right who might still be considered children in terms of their brain development. If they watch this, both of them would be super offended by that, but it is what it is. Child psychologists are given a new directive, which is to think of the age range they work with increasing from 0 to 18 to 0 to 25. Where do we see this in our culture? Well, we see it with people taking a little longer to do things that they might have done earlier on. That means maybe, I have a 19-year-old in my house who is right now learning how to drive. I learned to drive when I was 15. That's when I started, getting my learner's permit and then taking driving lessons. Many people wait a little bit longer to have children. Many people wait a little longer to go to school or to go back to school when it comes to college, right? So this is sort of how these ideas are impacting us. And this is some of the ways in which the same ideas impacted the people in the Victorian times that we're looking at. So medieval models of childhood. We have Felipe Arias as a scholar who claims childhood was discovered in the 17th century. He says, in medieval society, the sentiment of childhood did not exist. You can see even in this picture, the baby... I love the baby in the background. He's so cute and chubby. The baby here has night clothes on, but these are little children, right? And they are dressed just as their parents would, just smaller versions of adult clothing, right? And this sort of reflects this idea that childhood as a sentiment doesn't really exist. The sense or the feeling about childhood and the concept of it. Family shows families showed affection for their children, but there's less a separation between adults and kids in medieval times. And childhood was not really recognized as a distinct phase of human existence. Now, in part, this is because of the morals and the philosophy of the times. In part, it's just due to birth rates. You can see here the transition from infant mortality rate from the pre-industrial time. We have a very low population growth. And then we have in the industrial era and the post-industrial era, we have a higher population growth as the death rates drop for infant mortality. And then the birth rates start to drop too, because don't need to have quite as many children because the ones that you do have are surviving longer. Right? So we talked about this last time a little bit, that there was this idea that children needed to be instructed and taught, but it's kind of like, hey, this is an adult sort of being that just doesn't have all the knowledge yet. I guess that's the best way I can put it, although I feel like that's a little bit reductive. But yeah, we have children as little adults here. We've got apprenticeship, a baker's apprentice. We have a girl who's a shepherdess, children working in coal mines. And then there comes this shift, right? Where here, young child workers are asking for justice. They're asking to go to school. So we then start to see some social changes of compulsory education and free education for all, and an end to child labor. And we have, like in the United States, we have people like Teddy Roosevelt really working for this and helping to put in some laws that restrict child labor. Now, there is still child labor going on in the world. Unfortunately, we have here a picture of really little kids and numbers of small hands, how many children are working. You notice the countries that that's happening in are developing countries. As this graph says, some of the poorest regions in the world. So I think that in part, it's really important to note that some of the philosophies about childhood and this end to childhood labor, this movement from the Progressive Party at the time and these reformers, are because the countries in which this was happening, there were some social improvements and people could sort of afford to make these changes. And in many places, it's still sort of thought that they cannot. So what are some of our changing concepts? There's an illustration from Little Women. Well, we have a couple of things. First is this idealized romantic child. This idea during Victorian times that children are naturally innocent and close to God. We see things like this in the book Heidi. We also have, on the other end, that children are naturally, innately sinful and in constant need of discipline and vigilance. So sort of two conflicting ideas. John Locke in 1689, well before our time period, but philosophers often are, right? They're pushing some ideas forward that take a while to be embraced. But he says children are born with a blank slate or tabula rasa. So they're not innately innocent. They're not innately sinful. They're just sort of a blank slate. Their environment determines what they become. In education should focus on cultivating the intellect, instilling a strong moral sense, teaching wisdom and virtue as well as knowledge. Now we see this in Little Women, although because it's nearly 200 years after John Locke, we also see a little bit of fun and playfulness and whimsy, and all of our characters have flaws, and even at the end they don't fully overcome them. They're just more they're more realistic, I guess, than somebody like Goody Two Shoes that we talked about last time. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really believed in a natural space of freedom for children. The best we can offer our children is an upbringing full of freedom, possibilities to follow their curiosity and opportunities, to explore and make their own experiences. In this way, they become confident and self-reliant. There seems to be a little bit of a typo there. But At any rate, yeah, where do we see this? I will tell you the first place, Montessori preschools. They are set up to be sort of a place of natural freedom where there's stations set up. And yes, there are teachers looking over those stations, but kids can kind of move from one area to the next. I worked in a Montessori preschool and we had like not the little fake pretend plastic drills and hammers and things, but we had real hammers and nails for kids to play with. We were there to supervise them. And it was a station that didn't last the full year, I will say that. Another time we're doing a farm unit, and in one corner, one of the teachers brought in a couple bales of hay, and the kids just had a ball with the hay rolling around in it. And thankfully, nobody had allergies. But yeah, it was this idea that kids should be able to explore things. And if they want to go play with the hay and kind of check it out and roll around in it and use it in a sensory way, they can. Much different than a more traditional school where everyone is sitting at a desk and they're sitting there for 8 hours, right? This is also seen in books like Alice in Wonderland. She's making her own experiences curiouser and curiouser. That is an important piece of that book, right? There's freedom to follow those curiosities. What is that? What's going on? Where's that rabbit going? Let me find out. Like, that is part of childhood, right? So that's a concept that really was a little bit newer at the time. And here are the declining child mortality rates. You can see in 1800, we go from 1 in 3 children dying to 1 in 5. That might not sound like a huge difference, but it really was. You have to think of like 33% as opposed to 20%. And we go down even further from there. The graph cuts off, but once we hit the 1920s, you can see this sharp decline during this time period. Rates are still high. So in literature, childhood illness and death are really powerful themes still. We'll see that in The Secret Garden. There is a character who people believe for a while is really deathly ill. There's also some of that in Pollyanna as well. Some concerns for health, but the lowering mortality rates really meant that children were living longer. So again, we have this as a defined period of life. Oh, and side note, a lot of these medical changes can be attributed to Ignaz Semmelweis, an Hungarian obstetrician, early medical investigator. He's known as the father of hand hygiene and the savior of mothers. His work in 1847 really demonstrates hand washing, antiseptic procedures can prevent the spread of infection. Credit is also due to Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, who acted as nurses during the Crimean War. There they are right there. And then Clara Barton, who founded the American branch of the Red Cross. You'll notice our time periods here, right? 1847, Civil War is 1860. So all of these changes in medicine lead to the decline of birth rates. Combine that with the philosophies that came a couple decades before, and that is there's some of the cultural context that lead you to then changes in how children are seen, how they're educated, and how books are written for them. So we also have some other emerging theories. Charles Darwin believed that physiological expression of the emotions in humans was no different than in the kind exhibited by animals. For example, he felt infants 10 to 12 months had similar language development to dogs, but with the ability to hear, understand, and replicate speech. We see this in the books, The Jungle Book and Tarzan, and in the picture right here, right? So we have sort of feral child idea that kids are sort of closer to animals in nature somehow. Then we also have the psychology of childhood, a time of complex and unruly passions that could form and foreshadow and sometimes threaten the adult world. So, is this idea that the experiences of childhood are crucial to the subsequent development of the adult mind. Wordsworth said the child is the father of man. So we have this Bildungsroman, coming of age genre. Jane Eyre and David Copperfield, not necessarily at the time books for children, but I would say we also see this in Anne of Green Gables, that she has some unruly passions and she is trying throughout almost the entire book to control those passions because her caretakers really know that if she doesn't, this might be harmful for her as an adult. But she still has the place to play and explore and have this very vivid imagination that at times gets her into trouble. So we'll see that too. But yes, does education stunt the body? So this is another concept that really influenced some writers at the time. I like this little cartoon of a jock being like, "Hey, nerd," and then the girl looking at the jock. And I don't know if he's chasing the nerd or if the nerd decided to read a book while running to enhance his brain. But that's sort of where we still see this misconception. In Victorian visions of childhood development, Sally Shuttleworth explained that these really affected ideas about child laborers. And we see this especially in the book Water Babies, where we have a character who is also a chimney sweep. She writes that while some argued for educational reform, including moving away from rigorous testing, some medical opposition was based in the belief that the body has a finite amount of energy, and if diverted to the brain, it would lead to stunted growth, or in the case of women, an inadequate development of the reproductive system. Now, the idea of overpressure was then used to oppose the higher education of women and the extension of education to the working classes. So some people basically used this idea in a negative sense and said, well, if that's the case and education harms physical development, then women should not learn things because they won't be able to have children. And the working classes should not learn things because then they will not be able to work. And, the upper classes of males especially, they can learn and read and become philosophers and great thinkers because physically they don't really have to do that type of labor. That's the negative side. The positive side is that because some people believed this, stories for children were thought to maybe be a little less rigorous and a little bit more fun so that we wouldn't stunt our bodies, which is so interesting to me. So should childhood be preserved? This is a big question in our in the culture of this time. Here we have a little illustration of Peter Pan and Wendy sewing on his shadow. Since many see childhood as the raw material from which adults were made, which we just saw with Wordsworth, there's also this prevailing idea that childhood should be hurried through to reach adulthood. That was sort of before the Victorian period. But we also see the development of the cult of childhood that really persists into this golden age of children's literature. Adults really celebrating childhood in texts and images, and parents moving to preserve the period of childhood. How long can we keep Wendy in the nursery before she has to move to her own room and sort of start to grow up? Some characters die in the world in order to sort of be reborn, which happens with the book Water Babies. Some stay children forever, especially elsewhere, as we see in the play Peter Pan. So consider how we're still having these debates today. Young adult literature didn't really develop until the 1970s. Why? Because before that point, many people were going straight from high school right into jobs. In the 70s and 80s, more people started to go to college. So this idea of your high school years as being a separate time of your life and your college years also, that delayed typical adult milestones like career, marriage, children. We have new adult literature now about people in their 20s and 30s who are coming out of college for the first time, and stories about them having their first careers, their first love after, getting done with school, that kind of thing. So to recap, the golden age of children's literature lasted from 1865 to 1926. This was a formative period for children's literature in Britain, the United States, and Canada. Due to improvements in quality of life and changes in philosophy and proto or early psychology, the Golden Age saw a radical reconfiguration of the perception of children and childhood. Childhood was now considered a separate and distinct period, different from adulthood. And since childhood was romanticized a bit and thought of as a time of innocence and play, books were written specifically to entertain and delight children. And here we have excerpts from two books that I think you really see the stark differences before this time period and after. So this is the ending of Goody Two-Shoes. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I do want to just read part of this. At her first coming into power, she took care to gratify her old friends, especially Mr. and Mrs. Smith, whose family she made happy. She paid great regard for the poor, made their interest her own, and to induce them to come regularly to church, she ordered a loaf, or the price of a loaf, to be given to every one who would accept of it. This brought many of them to church, who by degrees learned their duty, and then came more noble principle. She also took care to encourage matrimony, and in order to induce her tenants and neighbors to enter into their happy state, she always gave the couple something toward housekeeping, and stood godmother to all their children, whom she had at parties every Sunday evening to teach them their catechism and lecture them in religion and morality, after which she treated them with supper, gave them such books as they wanted, and dispatched them with her blessing. Nor did she forget them at her death, but left each a legacy, as will be seen, among other charitable donations, when we publish her will, which we may do so in a further volume. Then it goes on from there. So we have a mother to the poor, a physician to the sick, a friend to whom all are in distress. This woman is basically depicted like Christ himself, right? So this is Marjorie Meanwell, as we know her in the beginning of the story. And what do we have here at the end? A very long lecture. I cut out the poem. There's also a lengthy poem after this, but it's kind of a little lecture about how we should be, right? How do we get people to come to church? Well, we give them bread, or we give them money for bread, and this will bring them to church, and then maybe they'll stay and they'll listen and they'll come for more of the bread, and they'll come for their daily bread, right? And it's not a bad idea. I want to say that. I'm not saying that it's a bad idea. What I'm saying is it's poorly written. It's not bad to give people food and to feed the hungry, right? It's not bad to have people over for parties, but then you're lecturing them in morality, which I think is very interesting. She's giving them such books as they wanted, but only the certain types, like this book, right? We're encouraging people to get married, but then specifically giving them something toward their housekeeping. She's planting yearly potatoes for the poor. These are all wonderful things, and being a physician to the sick and the friend to those who are in distress. But it's just a list moralizing for kids, right? I can't imagine. I did not read this entire book. I've read excerpts of it. I can't imagine trying to teach this entire book because it would just be insufferable, you guys. I mean, really. Let's compare that to Alice in Wonderland. This is the beginning of Alice. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, as well she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies. Then suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time it seemed quite natural. So you can really see the shift here, right? We're not just having a perfect little child character who can, grow up to be a perfect adult and to do everything right. Alice here is bored. She doesn't want to read. The book doesn't have any pictures. It doesn't have any conversations, so it's probably nonfiction. She's with her older sister, and she's kind of too lazy to even make a daisy chain. And then we have a talking rabbit, and these really interesting comments in parentheses. Alice is sleepy and stupid, and she really should have wondered about the rabbit talking, but at the time it seemed fine. So it's quite illogical, and yet not, because it's for children, right? And we see, I think, with these two excerpts, the difference between being didactic and being moralizing, and then here, just, writing for fun and using things like logic in play to make fun of logic a little bit and to make fun of the lessons, like having these books with no pictures. Yuck. That's basically what Lewis Carroll is doing. So I hope that you guys have better understanding of our time period of the golden age of children's literature, and I can't wait to see your thoughts on the books this week. Thanks.